I recently ran into a really interesting article online called "It's Not Just You, New York City Has a Severe Dungeon Master Shortage." This is a sentiment that I've been hearing more and more of from 5th edition players, not just those in New York, and it struck me as very interesting since it is the complete opposite of my experience in the old school Renaissance D&D scene. In order to figure out if my experience was unique or not, I posted a couple of polls on my channel's community tab, asking for other people's experiences, and the results were fascinating. When I asked about 5e, only 19% of respondents said that more than half of the 5e fans they knew were dungeon masters. That pretty much lines up with what the article said. But the poll about the old school Renaissance scene was wildly different. In that poll, 44% said that more than half of the OSR fans that they knew were dungeon masters. And even more shockingly, 29% said that most or all of them were. Compare that to the 5% of people that could say the same thing about 5e, and you start seeing a massive cultural difference between these two D&D scenes. This got me thinking about what could be causing this huge disparity. One thing that I think is definitely a factor is that 5e is growing very quickly, so there's a lot of new players in it. In contrast, the OSR has a lot of players that have been around since the 70s or 80s, so they've had more time to develop those dungeon mastering skills. While this partially explains the discrepancy, I don't think that it goes all the way. The majority of people that I know in the OSR aren't old grognards, but relatively young people who got immersed in this stuff in the last decade or so. Also, when people get involved in the OSR, my experience has been that they get very excited about DMing almost right away, whereas that does not seem to be happening as much in 5e. I think the real key to 5e's DM shortage can be found in that original article actually. But before we go back to look at that, a quick shout out to today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Skillshare, an online learning community with thousands of online classes for anyone who wants to develop their creativity and learn new skills. They've got classes on creating your own fantasy maps, drawing old school D&D dungeons, world building, character illustration, and many more topics for old school DMs. I just started taking a class by Patrick Inhofer called DaVinci Resolve 16, the complete video editing course to improve my editing skills, and I've already found all sorts of shortcuts and tools to make my life easier. The whole platform is completely ad-free, and the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. That will let you check out their classes and dive in right away. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring. Now let's get back to the show. So when you read that original article, here's how it describes the task of being a DM. Playing the role of Dungeon Master can be a rewarding job, but it is sometimes thankless and always taxing. D&D can be overwhelming to any new player. This is especially true for a DM who needs to know all of the rules, adjudicate them, create or manage the story, plan logistics for their group, and cater the experience to what each player wants. The amount of effort involved makes it inaccessible for new players and difficult for experienced ones to sustain long term. I mean, if that's what it takes to be a dungeon master, then they're right. If I had to be a combination of reference book, epic storyteller, event coordinator, and life coach, I wouldn't want to be a DM either. That's just not the kind of person I am. The 5e subculture has managed to put dungeon masters on such a high pedestal that it feels out of reach for anyone who isn't an extroverted polymath. On the other hand, I think the reason old school D&D has such a glut of dungeon masters is the same reason why D&D originally took off back in the 70s. It's simple and straightforward to run. In old school D&D, you don't need to know all of the rules, although usually they're so simple that they're really not that hard to memorize, and you don't need to create a story either, especially not one that caters the experience to what each player wants. Creating a good story is very hard, and often professional novelists can't even pull it off well. So why would you expect that of dungeon masters? Instead, all you have to do is create a place, a location for the adventure to happen. A dungeon is the classic example, of course, but really it could be any kind of location that's interesting to explore and has a good mix of dangers, rewards, surprises, and weird stuff to poke at. Once that's done, your job as a dungeon master becomes relatively simple. All you have to do is describe to the players what they see around them and how it reacts to their choices. No worrying about character arcs or whether the PCs beat that boss monster too quickly. All you need to do is take a neutral referee stance and play the world. Now, if you're used to the 5e conception of a dungeon master, this might seem a little bit dull in comparison, but let me tell you, it is one heck of a lot easier to learn and an absolute breeze to run. I've seen 10-year-olds competently run dungeons after only playing a few sessions of the game. Heck, the basic D&D rules from 1980 are explicitly targeted at 10-year-olds and gives them concrete step-by-step instructions on how to create a scenario for play. Where is that for 5e? It often comes as a surprise how much fun players can have when there's no plot to follow, and they can genuinely explore the world like it's real. It can also be even more surprising how frequently these kinds of location-based scenarios generate their own stories, just from letting the players get into and out of trouble. Of course, there are plenty of skills related to this style of play that still need to be honed. Some dungeons are more interesting than others, for example, and you can get better at designing them. But really, you need shockingly little to get 90% of the way there. The Dungeon Master's Guide in Old School and New School editions even includes tools for procedurally generating dungeons that are perfectly acceptable, although they often need a bit of sprucing up. Switching from plot-based adventures to location-based adventures dramatically cuts down on your prep time and stress levels, and it's allowed a lot of dungeon masters that I know to run campaigns for years or even decades with very minimal work. As longtime viewers already know, this channel is dedicated to reviewing adventures and tools for the location-based style of play, so I have lots of recommendations if you want something that is pre-made. A great place to start, if you're new to the channel, is my Questing Beast Awards, where I point out the top releases from each year. As far as 5th edition goes, I'm really curious to see if it can survive this bottleneck. A D&D play culture cannot grow without lots of dungeon masters, and you don't get those unless the game is relatively easy to run and low stress. In my view, the game's resurgence is only going to be sustainable if it returns to a state where a bright 10-year-old could pretty easily run it. But whether Wizards of the Coast or 5e culture in general is willing to make that change remains to be seen. Well, what do you think? What does D&D need the most to make it more accessible for dungeon masters and to get people excited about running the game? What tricks have you learned that make dungeon mastering simpler and easier? Leave it down in the comments below, and thanks for watching. Before we go, a huge thank you to all of those new patrons who started supporting this channel on Patreon last month. I sincerely mean it when I say that Questing Beast can only continue because of their support. If you want to join their ranks and get a bunch of cool perks, like access to early drafts of my RPG Knave 2nd Edition, you can find that link in the description below. See you next time!